Hey guys, this is Dan with Gears and Gadgets. Thanks for tuning in. So I put 300 miles, about 330 miles on this Slingshot this week, and I am very excited to come to you guys with this review because honestly, I was pleasantly surprised. Prior to recording any of these videos, I didn't really know a whole lot about Slingshots and what they were about. I did see them around town, but as a motorcycle rider, I kind of would look at these things and just kind of scratch my head a little bit. That perspective changed almost immediately. Now, I'm not big on coming out in these kinds of videos and just reading spec sheets because, well, that's boring. But I will say there is a lot to talk about with these Slingshots. And first, there's kind of a wide range of options with these, and I think it's interesting to talk about in this instance. First, they have the Slingshot S, the SL, the SLR, the R and the LE, and the range of price on these gets to be pretty big. You can basically start around 20,000, and by the time you're done with options, you can put these things, depending on the way you spec them out, up to about 45,000. There's just a wide range of options with these Slingshots. With this one in particular, this is the 2022 Slingshot SL. Now, something that was very fascinating to me that I did not know was that with these Polaris Slingshots, I know that a few years back they used to have a GM Ecotech motor in here, and now they actually run, which was several years ago and I had no idea, but they did switch to a Polaris 2.0 1997cc motor. And this thing, I will tell you, from opening up the engine compartment, the first time you do it, it's something where there's a whole new level of respect for what the Slingshot is, because this is not just something that has been slapped together. You are presented with some very nice A-arms, really nice coilover suspension, and ultimately everything looks very well put together. It also has 178 horsepower, but that horsepower number is achieved banging it off the RPM limiter. That is at 8,500 RPM. And most people aren't going to drive consistently up at that range to pull that power. And the torque numbers are achieved at 5,500 RPM, and it is 120 foot-pounds of torque. But all in, it's actually very respectable for the 1,600 pounds or so that this thing weighs. And in terms of a seat dyno, they feel very sufficient. Again, I would like to maybe consider putting a turbo on something like this, but for your average person driving, I think they would be totally fine with what this thing does put out. Now, top speed is at 125 miles an hour. Good luck finding anybody who's going to be brazen enough to drive it at those speeds. I do think it rides pretty well up to about 80 miles an hour. Just being a three-wheeled vehicle in general, the faster you're going, the more you get any steering inputs. They like to kind of bounce around. I do think it would be very fun buying one of these things and getting into a turbo kit, so much so that after I drove this, I started thinking, like, this would be such a fun vehicle to wrench on, specifically on the channel, but honestly, just in general. Now, in terms of front end feel with this Slingshot, these Kenda, I think specifically made for these Slingshot tires, these are 18-inch on front. These are 225/45 18s. In terms of being planted around corners, very, very solid. I think this tire setup is perfect for the Slingshot. The only concern I had was stopping power. These are the standard one piston caliper brakes, and they do offer a 4-piston from Brembo. I would highly recommend it. The brakes aren't bad on this, but I will say that there were times when I was doing my sportier driving around Tortilla Flat where I would have liked to carry more speed into the corner, but I felt I was constantly braking early because I just didn't really feel like I had enough brake that I wanted in those situations. So I think the $2,000 for the 4-piston setup calipers for Brembos is a good amount of money to be spent for these Slingshots. That's my recommendation. Now, on the backside here, this is a 255/35 20-inch, again, Kenda radial, and I believe they offer them in a 305, which is a much wider tire. It's a very, very interesting situation when you talk about three-wheeled vehicles with the drive wheel being the rear. It's more planted than I ever would have anticipated. Matter of fact, when driving this thing spirited around the twisties, it feels very compliant. But when you do a clutch dump on this thing, you can get this wheel spinning very quickly, and it becomes an absolute blast. Again, as you turn off traction control and some of those aids, you can really get this thing spinning. It is belt driven, and honestly, it's again, more compliant than I ever would have imagined out of a 3-wheel vehicle. But it definitely is different from driving a 4-wheeled vehicle with rear-wheel drive. There is a bit of a learning curve that comes with it. But again, I was very pleasantly surprised with this setup. Now, in terms of creature comforts, getting in and out of these things isn't necessarily always graceful. It does require a bit of a learning curve, but it is actually a very comfortable place to drive. You have a lot of really, really nice features here. You have volume on the steering wheel, you've got pause, play, you've got next track, previous track, cruise control, slingshot, comfortable mode. You've got a absolutely beautiful infotainment system that hooks to Apple CarPlay. These ride times and volts and temperature gauge, and there's so much information here. It's just a great system. Traction control, flashers, really nice toggle switches here. You've got these nice gauge cluster here, which reads very well when driving. Adjustable steering wheel, and everything it's right there. I think this thing is designed very well. You've got a nice, very big glove box here. Little storage in here. And there's also helmet storage behind the seats that is actually big enough to be able to fit a backpack, a full face helmet. It's very practical, much more practical than what I would have ever anticipated. And again, it's just a very nice place to be. The seats, I found them to be very comfortable. And also an added benefit, you can basically pressure wash the entire thing. Everything is weather tight, and you're able to kind of just wash this thing out. I will say one of the things I was concerned about when driving this is that you don't have a rear view camera view, or even just a rear view. You only have your side mirrors, and the lighting on the back of this thing is also very good. So lighting like this is very well appreciated, and honestly, the full LED lighting all around, very good at night. So let's get out on the road. I want to talk about this thing a little bit more in terms of what I really think about it and who I think it's for, and some of the emotion of it all. So let's get out there and go for a ride. So out here on the road to talk about this thing in terms of what it's like to drive, I did put 330 miles on this past week, and I was using it as a commuter back and forth to work. The majority of the week when I was able to just basically either be in the office or go back and forth to job sites with minimal amounts of stuff, you can just toss a bag in here and go. And honestly, in terms of a functional daily commuter, I was much more surprised how compliant this was in that role. It also made the lunch much more enjoyable. Going back and forth to get some food and just those little short runs are much more enjoyable in this than they are, say, a Honda Civic. So with this, as a motorcycle rider as well, this is much more convenient to be able to use as a commuter because, well, there's not as much gear. You don't have to put the jacket on, and I understand there's guys out there who don't ride with helmets, jackets, boots, the whole nine. In terms of my comfort of riding, yeah, it's true, Polaris does make you wear a helmet. I would wear a helmet all the time anyways, for the most part, aside from maybe just a quick trip down a city street, 30 miles an hour. Anything over 30 to, 80, 100, I would definitely want to wear a helmet because as you're driving, you're in this open cockpit environment that things kind of are blowing around and you can get some just even dust and road debris in your eyes. To me, the full face helmet, if you're going to wear goggles, you might as well just put on a helmet anyways. So that's kind of my take on the most amount of safety gear that I would personally put on to drive this thing. So it's just easier than getting on the bike and having to suit up with all that stuff, and then the ability just to toss a bag in really quickly and not have to lash it all down makes it just super simple. Now this thing, to me, what's fascinating and I was very interested in getting my hands on was other people's perceptions. I personally am just a fan of power sports in general, and anything that people can put a motor in and just get on and rip through gears, I'm all for it. So this, though, I was very interested to know what people would think. And I was honestly kind of thinking that people were going to be a lot more critical of it than they were. Most people, and I would say the majority of the people, was very interested in this thing. And it put smiles not only on my face all week,
But everybody else that I saw, more than any motorcycle I've ever ridden before, this thing got way more smiles and conversation because it's just that much more unique. I think for your average person who doesn't ride motorcycles, a motorcycle's a motorcycle. This is not that. Now, in terms of sporty riding, getting out and just ripping through gears and having a good old time in this Slingshot, it serves that purpose very well. Matter of fact, last night I was eating dinner and I was watching a Rob Dahm all-wheel drive four-rotor rotary engine custom build project that he has. I'm not really totally sure what it is he's calling it. Look at that, I even got the motorcycle wave. Not sure what he's calling it, but I was watching that video last night and he was shaking down that car. Awesome build series. I'll link it up above. He doesn't need my links by no means, but watching that video and he's just banging through that sequential gearbox. The whine out of this gearbox is a much more affordable version of what I was watching Rob Dahm rip through last night. I watched that video, and as I was watching it, I'm like, you know, I got to get out and drive that Slingshot, because that made me realize a big portion of who this vehicle is for. I'm not the greatest heel toe shifter. I don't know all of those ins and outs, technique, hitting aprons, all that stuff. But I know what it all means. And there's a huge part of me that kind of likes to just get in a vehicle like this and I guess pretend like I can do that. And that's a huge thing that this thing does, is it really scratches that itch of somebody who just wants to get out and drive. This is like a very interesting mix of go-kart meets Mazda Miata meets motorcycle. It's just got all of the best endearing qualities of each one of those things mashed into one beautiful machine. That is a huge part of who this is for. The other aspect of this is cruising. I'm up here on the highway. You throw your elbow up on this little armrest up here, which I don't know if that's intentional. I would have to imagine it is. It's very nice to just sit here and cruise 80 miles an hour. It does get to be a little bit bouncy. If you get on the steering, it wants to kind of drift around lanes. But in this scenario, if you just throw one hand on the wheel, nice comfortable grip, another hand down here by the gear shifter. You don't have to ride with it on the gear shifter, which is bad for gear boxes anyways, but they have this nice angled plastic piece here, and also over here too. I find myself kind of resting depending on where I'm at, but there's kind of like a nice natural ergonomic way to chill in this thing. Very compelling as just a get out and cruise around. Tortilla flat that I just did last weekend is out that way, so the ride there is super comfortable, and then the ride while you're there is exhilarating. So it's doing all of that stuff well, and that's something that I think is a very difficult thing to engineer. So hats off to Polaris in being able to do that. Now to, of course, mention a couple things that I do think can be better. I know I mentioned at the brake part of this, talking about the specs, that I would absolutely opt for those 4-piston Brembos. These brakes are fine for the cruising part of what this is. It stops totally fine. But in the tortilla flat segment last video, where I was kind of trying to really drive this thing sporty, now part of my apprehensiveness was it was new to me and I don't know what it's doing yet, and there's always a learning curve with that. But one of the things I felt like pretty quickly was that I had to brake way early just because of the brake feel wasn't enough, and I would definitely opt for those 4-piston Brembos so that I could kind of carry speed into corners a little bit more than what I was comfortable doing at that time. I think that $2,000 for those Brembos, very well worth it. Now, the other thing is visibility. Out of the mirrors, I can actually see behind me pretty well. But when you get up to a red light, you know, right now cruising down the highway, I'm comfortable with what I can see. But if I had to get on the brakes quickly and looked, I wouldn't totally know if the vehicle I saw in my mirror behind me was the actual vehicle behind me or if somebody was right up on my rear end. So it would be nice, and I don't think they have it, somebody correct me if I'm wrong in the comments down below, to be able to switch this to the rear view backup camera to be able to actually see a good picture of what was happening behind me. I think that's something they should do. in the future, because I would probably leave that up all the time, being that there is no high rear view mirror here, and if there was, you couldn't see it because of the shark fin behind you anyways. So I would like to have that rear view camera. And then the other thing that I would like to have different is, after 3 or 4 days of daily driving this thing, this elbow rest, which is actually perfect location for me, it'd actually be nice to have that be padded. It is just a hard plastic. So it'd be nice to have just a little bit similar padding that you have on this armrest over here, same material up over on this part over here. That would be very well worth it. So that is probably it. I think I might do another video on this after this video, going through exactly how I would spec one of these out. I love this thing. Granted, one-man jury. Everything is not for everybody, and there are certainly most likely comments from people that don't get it, but I know there's a huge following of these Slingshots, and anybody that I know that I've run across in the last week that's had the ability to drive a Slingshot, not a single one of them has had a bad thing to say. Matter of fact, the moment they talk about a Slingshot, smile ear to ear, and most people just absolutely, that have driven these things, they love them. I think that there's plenty of people out there that would just have an absolute blast in something like this. So with that being said, guys, I thank you very much for tuning in. If this is your first time tuning in, please hit that subscribe button down below. Remember, likes go a long way to help support the channel, and without your guys' support, none of this nonsense of me being able to go out and, you know, drive around awesome things like this exists. So I am forever grateful for that. So again, thank you guys very much. I'll see you in the next one.